Every second in this house is recorded, but the truth is never in the footage alone. In a vast secluded estate outside Chicago, Ethan Blackwell, a white male mafia boss in his late 30s, stood in a dark surveillance command room illuminated only by the cold glow of 63 synchronized security monitors, each feed displaying a different angle of his controlled empire. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, the kind of stillness that came from years of absolute authority rather than peace. On the central screen, his only son Oliver Blackwell, a 7-year-old boy confined to a medically supported bed, remained almost motionless in a quiet luxury bedroom designed to preserve life but not necessarily restore it. Ethan had built this system of surveillance himself, believing that observation was the highest form of protection, that cameras could prevent chaos before it ever formed. Every hallway, every door, every room in the mansion existed under constant digital awareness, leaving no space for uncertainty. Yet despite this perfection of control, Oliver's condition had remained unchanged for months. His responses minimal, his world silent except for the presence of caretakers rotating on strict schedules. That silence was what Ethan feared most, not because it was empty, but because it was unmeasurable. He leaned slightly forward, eyes scanning each feed with mechanical precision, when a system notification appeared on the lower edge of the central screen. New staff assignment approved. He opened the file without hesitation. Sophie Carter, 26 years old, domestic staff classification, standard background clearance, no flagged incidents. Ordinary, replaceable, temporary. In Ethan Blackwell's world, ordinariness meant safety because predictability meant control. On another feed, the mansion's East Wing corridor showed movement for the first time in the sequence. A young woman entered the frame wearing a modest maid uniform, her posture calm but alert, her steps quiet against the marble floor. Sophie Carter did not look around in awe of the environment, nor did she hesitate in fear of it. She simply moved forward with steady intention. Toward Oliver's room. Ethan's gaze narrowed slightly as he isolated her camera feed, tracking her path in real time. She paused briefly at the doorway before entering, a pause that lasted only seconds but was longer than protocol recommended. Then she stepped inside. Inside the monitored bedroom, Oliver remained still as Sophie approached his bedside. From Ethan's perspective through the camera, nothing about the moment should have mattered. Staff entered and exited rooms every day. Protocols were followed, medical routines maintained, schedules executed with precision. Yet something subtle changed in the visual rhythm of the feed the moment Sophie sat beside the child instead of standing at a distance. She did not speak immediately. She did not adjust equipment or check readings. She simply remained there, within reach, within presence, within a kind of silence that did not feel empty. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the console as he watched the stillness continue. Oliver, who had shown almost no sustained reaction in weeks, shifted his head by the smallest measurable degree toward her direction. The system did not flag it as significant, but Ethan saw it. And for the first time in a long time, control no longer felt like certainty, because something in the room had begun to respond without permission. In the surveillance command room, Ethan Blackwell did not move from his position in front of the monitor wall, but his focus had narrowed to a single live feed, as if the rest of his empire had temporarily ceased to matter. The central screen still displayed Oliver Blackwell in his quiet, medically supported bedroom, while the adjacent feed continued to show Sophie Carter seated beside him. At first glance, nothing appeared structurally different from standard care interactions. Yet Ethan's attention was no longer processing the scene as routine. He pulled up the behavioral tracking overlay linked to Oliver's room, scanning for micro-changes in movement, eye orientation, and neurological response indicators. The system returned minimal activity data for months prior, consistent with previous reports, but the current session was different. Small fluctuations were now appearing in sequence rather than isolation. Oliver's head remained subtly angled toward Sophie, maintaining a direction of attention longer than any recorded baseline. Ethan zoomed in on the audio feed, filtering background system noise, and detected Sophie speaking in a calm, steady tone that did not match any structured therapeutic protocol stored in the medical system. She was not issuing commands or attempting stimulation sequences. Instead, her presence appeared to follow a pattern of patience, allowing silence to exist without interruption. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he opened the historical interaction logs, comparing Sophie's current behavior against standard caregiver rotations. There was no formal training record indicating specialized pediatric engagement techniques, no certification entries suggesting behavioral therapy experience, nothing that would logically explain deviation from expected outcomes. Yet Oliver's responses continued to shift. A small movement of his hand occurred on the screen, barely perceptible, but sustained long enough for the system to register it as intentional variation rather than reflex. Ethan paused the feed for a fraction of a second, then resumed playback to confirm continuity. It was consistent. Sophie adjusted her posture slightly, repositioning herself closer to Oliver's field of view without touching any medical equipment. Her movements controlled and deliberate but not procedural. Ethan opened a secondary diagnostic layer, cross-referencing oxygen stability, heart rate rhythm, and neurological feedback loops. All indicators remained within stable medical parameters, yet within those parameters a new pattern was forming. Engagement duration was increasing in real time. Oliver, who had previously shown no sustained attention response, was now maintaining orientation toward Sophie for extended intervals without regression. Ethan stepped closer to the monitor wall, his reflection merging faintly with the blue glow of the screens. And for the first time since the system had been installed, he did not immediately issue a correction command. Instead, he observed. Sophie did not attempt to escalate interaction. She simply remained present, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze steady and non-intrusive. Oliver's movement occurred again, slower this time, a slight adjustment that suggested awareness rather than involuntary motion. The system flagged the event as low-confidence anomaly due to insufficient historical correlation data, but Ethan ignored the classification. He was no longer evaluating system output. He was evaluating reality as it unfolded outside of expectation. And in that quiet bedroom, beneath layers of surveillance, something unfamiliar had begun to persist long enough to be measured, and long enough to challenge everything he believed control had already secured. In the surveillance command room, Ethan Blackwell remained fixed in front of the wall of monitors, but the structure of his attention had changed from observation to evaluation, as if every second of footage now required verification against a reality he could no longer assume was stable. The central feed still showed Oliver Blackwell in his quiet bedroom, the same medically supported environment that had defined the past months of unchanged data, while Sophie Carter remained seated beside him, her presence calm, consistent, and increasingly difficult to categorize within any existing protocol. Ethan reopened the behavioral analytics panel, forcing a full recalculation of engagement metrics from the beginning of her interaction. The system responded with incremental updates, showing a gradual increase in sustained attention duration that did not align with any therapeutic model stored in the medical database. Oliver's gaze, which had previously drifted without fixation, now remained oriented toward Sophie for longer intervals, creating a continuity pattern that should not have been statistically possible under his recorded condition. Ethan zoomed further into the live feed, isolating micro-movements in Oliver's face and hands, searching for irregularity or mechanical inconsistency. But what he observed instead was progression. A slight adjustment of posture, followed by a pause, then another subtle shift toward engagement. Sophie did not initiate any structured activity. She did not introduce devices, stimuli, or procedural exercises. Instead, she remained still, her posture aligned with Oliver's visual range, allowing silence to fill the space between them without interruption. Ethan opened the communication log connected to the room and confirmed that no external staff had entered or adjusted conditions during the observed window. The environment was unchanged, which meant the change was internal or relational rather than procedural. That distinction created a conflict in his analysis framework, because his entire system of control was built on the assumption that change required intervention. On the screen, Oliver's hand moved again, not abruptly, but with a measured slowness that suggested continuity rather than reflex. The movement held for a moment longer than previous instances before settling back into stillness. Ethan replayed the sequence twice, verifying frame accuracy, and each replay confirmed the same outcome. Sophie adjusted her position slightly, maintaining presence without increasing stimulation, her expression steady and composed, as if responding to a rhythm that was not visible in the data feeds. Ethan leaned closer to the monitor wall, his reflection merging with the cool blue light of the surveillance interface, and accessed the full historical archive of Oliver's condition progression. Every entry over the past months showed consistency in minimal response, no sustained attention, no directional focus. Yet the current feed contradicted that entire record in real time. Oliver was not only responding, he was maintaining response. The system flagged the pattern again as low confidence due to insufficient comparative baseline, but Ethan dismissed the alert without hesitation. He was no longer interested in classification thresholds. He was watching continuity form where there had only been absence. Sophie remained calm, her hands resting in her lap, her attention steady and unforced, and Oliver's gaze did not drift away. For the first time since the surveillance system had been installed, Ethan Blackwell did not immediately attempt to correct, replace, or control the variable he was observing, because what he was seeing could no longer be reduced to system output alone, and something inside the structure of his certainty had begun to quietly fail. In the surveillance command room, Ethan Blackwell stood in near stillness, but the data flowing across the monitor wall continued to challenge the internal structure of his decision-making process. The central feed remained locked on Oliver Blackwell's bedroom, where the child continued to show sustained visual engagement with Sophie Carter, the Black Maid who had now become the only variable consistently associated with change in the system. Ethan opened the temporal comparison module again, expanding the analysis window to include all recorded interactions from the beginning of Sophie's presence in the room. The system generated a continuous timeline of engagement metrics, and for the first time, the curve did not return to baseline. Instead, it showed a gradual but persistent elevation in responsiveness, as if the child's condition was not only reacting but adapting. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, isolating the exact moment where deviation began, and replayed the feed from that point forward. Sophie had not altered her behavior in any measurable way. She had not introduced stimuli, she had not modified environment conditions, and she had not initiated any structured therapeutic protocol. She had simply remained present. That persistence, when aligned against Oliver's gradual shift in attention, created a correlation that the system could not dismiss. Ethan leaned forward, placing one hand on the edge of the console as he reviewed the live biometric overlay once again. Oliver's heart rate variability remained stable, but micro-movement frequency had increased in a pattern that suggested cognitive engagement rather than reflexive motion. The system flagged the sequence as emerging anomaly with insufficient historical precedent for classification. Ethan did not acknowledge the alert. Instead, he expanded the video feed resolution and focused entirely on Oliver's face. The child's gaze, previously unfocused and transient, now remained directed toward Sophie for longer intervals without deviation. Sophie adjusted her position slightly within the frame, maintaining alignment with Oliver's line of sight, but still refrained from any active intervention. There was no instruction, no device, no external prompt. Only continuity. Ethan accessed the internal security log and confirmed once more that no medical staff had entered the room during the observation window, eliminating procedural interference as a factor. That confirmation left only one remaining variable: Sophie Carter. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, his expression tightening as he ran a secondary diagnostic simulation using predictive modeling based on historical care outcomes. The result returned failure to match established recovery pathways. Yet the live data contradicted that failure in real time. Oliver's attention span continued to extend beyond previous limits, and his micro-responses occurred with increasing consistency. Ethan stepped closer to the monitor wall, the glow of multiple feeds reflecting across his face, and for a brief moment he stopped analyzing and simply observed. Sophie did not move. Oliver did not withdraw. The system did not stabilize, but it also did not collapse. Instead, it evolved into a state that had never been recorded in the archive before: sustained engagement without intervention. Ethan's hand hovered near the communication override panel, but he did not activate it. For the first time since the surveillance system had been constructed, control did not present itself as the immediate solution, because what he was witnessing was no longer behaving like a system at all, but like a connection forming in real time beyond the boundaries of his design. In the surveillance command room, Ethan Blackwell remained positioned in front of the monitor wall, but the atmosphere around him had shifted from structured observation to something closer to unresolved analysis, as if every layer of data now required reinterpretation rather than confirmation. The central feed still displayed Oliver Blackwell in his bedroom, with Sophie Carter seated beside him, maintaining the same calm presence that had now become the only consistent factor across all observed changes. Ethan reopened the full behavioral timeline once again, expanding the dataset to include continuous recordings from the beginning of her interaction, and the system immediately reconstructed the progression curve. What he saw no longer resembled isolated improvement points. It showed a sustained upward trend in engagement metrics, uninterrupted and non-reverting, as if the child's responses were stabilizing into a new baseline rather than temporarily reacting. Ethan adjusted the visual overlay to isolate only instances of physical movement and gaze orientation, and the pattern became even clearer. Oliver was not simply reacting to stimuli. He was maintaining attention. That distinction created a shift in Ethan's internal assessment, because maintenance implied continuity, and continuity implied adaptation. On the live feed, Sophie remained still for several seconds longer than before, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, her attention directed entirely toward Oliver without forcing interaction. The absence of escalation in her behavior now appeared intentional rather than passive. Ethan opened the environmental control logs again, confirming that room conditions had not been altered since her entry. Lighting, temperature, and medical support systems remained within standard parameters. No external variable accounted for the change. He shifted focus to Oliver's biometric readouts, where subtle variations in neural activity patterns continued to appear in alignment with Sophie's presence. The system flagged the correlation as statistically emerging but insufficient for definitive classification, yet Ethan no longer relied on system confidence indicators alone. He leaned closer to the screen, narrowing his focus to the live interaction window, where Oliver's gaze remained directed toward Sophie longer than any previously recorded instance. Sophie adjusted her position slightly, not in response to system prompts or medical routine, but in alignment with Oliver's visual field, maintaining presence without intrusion. Ethan accessed the archival database of all caregiver interactions recorded over the past year, running a comparative scan against current footage, and the results returned consistent failure to replicate similar engagement patterns. Every prior attempt at structured intervention had produced short-lived responses followed by regression. What he was witnessing now did not follow that cycle. Instead, it sustained. Oliver's hand moved again, slowly, with a controlled duration that extended beyond reflex thresholds defined in his medical profile. Ethan replayed the segment multiple times, confirming that the movement was not artifact or misread signal. It was real and it was repeatable within the same session. Sophie did not react outwardly to the movement. She simply remained present, allowing silence to continue uninterrupted, and in that silence Oliver maintained orientation toward her without deviation. Ethan felt a subtle but persistent disruption in his analytical framework, because every system he had built to enforce predictability now displayed output that resisted stabilization. He opened the intervention history log one final time, confirming no changes in medication, no new therapy protocols, and no environmental adjustments. Everything remained constant except for the presence of one individual inside the room, Sophie Carter. Ethan's hand hovered above the communication interface, but he did not activate it. For the first time since the surveillance system had been operational, control did not present itself as an immediate response, because what was unfolding in front of him could no longer be contained within the definition of monitored behavior, and instead resembled something that was forming on its own, beyond instruction, beyond system design, and beyond his ability to predict its next state. In the surveillance command room, Ethan Blackwell stood motionless in front of the monitor wall, but the environment around him no longer felt like a system under control. It felt like a system observing him back through the data it was producing. The central feed remained locked on Oliver Blackwell's bedroom, where the child continued to maintain visual orientation toward Sophie Carter, the Black Maid whose presence had now become the only stable variable across every recorded deviation. Ethan reopened the full diagnostic timeline again, expanding the analysis window to include uninterrupted footage segments, and the system rendered a continuous progression curve that no longer resembled fluctuation but stabilization. Oliver's engagement was not rising and falling as expected under neurological limitation. It was holding. Ethan narrowed his focus on the real-time behavioral overlay, isolating attention duration as a standalone metric, and confirmed that the child was sustaining focus for longer intervals than any prior recorded instance. Sophie remained seated beside the bed, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and her presence consistent in a way that no longer appeared incidental. Ethan zoomed into the live feed again, examining micro-expressions in Oliver's face, searching for regression markers or fatigue indicators, but instead observed continuity. The child did not withdraw. He remained oriented toward her. Sophie made a minimal adjustment in posture, shifting slightly to remain within Oliver's visual alignment, but she did not initiate stimulation or structured interaction. There were no devices, no procedural interventions, no external prompts. Ethan opened the environmental stability logs once more, confirming that all controlled variables in the room remained unchanged since her entry. Lighting, oxygen support, temperature regulation, and monitoring equipment all remained within expected parameters. That left only one uncontrolled element: human presence. Ethan stepped closer to the screen wall, his reflection faintly merging with the blue glow of multiple live feeds, and reviewed the full sequence of interaction again from the beginning of the session. The pattern remained consistent across every replay. Oliver responded only when Sophie remained present without escalation. When she increased nothing, his attention increased. When she reduced action, his stability increased. That inversion of expected response logic created a conflict within Ethan's analytical framework because every model he trusted defined improvement as a function of intervention intensity, yet here improvement was emerging in the absence of escalation. On the live feed, Oliver's hand moved again, slow and deliberate, maintaining position longer than previous instances before settling back into stillness. Ethan immediately isolated the timestamp and cross-referenced it against biometric fluctuations, confirming synchronized neurological activity corresponding to the movement. The system flagged the event as sustained anomaly with increasing confidence level, but still withheld classification due to lack of precedent. Ethan did not acknowledge the system flag. Instead, he focused entirely on Sophie, who remained calm and unmoving, her attention steady, her presence uninterrupted. Oliver's gaze did not drift away from her. It remained fixed. Ethan accessed the communication override panel once again, his hand hovering over the activation interface, but he did not press it. For the first time since the surveillance infrastructure had been installed, the concept of intervention no longer appeared as a corrective necessity, because what he was witnessing was no longer behaving like a condition requiring control. It was behaving like a connection forming independently of instruction, and every layer of data he reviewed only reinforced one conclusion he had not yet allowed himself to fully accept: that the change occurring inside that room was not being produced by the system he built, but by something within it that he had never accounted for. In the surveillance command room, Ethan Blackwell remained standing in front of the monitor wall, but the sense of control that had once defined the space now felt increasingly conditional, as if every new frame of data required reevaluation rather than confirmation. The central feed still displayed Oliver Blackwell in his bedroom, with Sophie Carter seated beside him, and the continuity of their interaction had now extended beyond what Ethan could classify as incidental observation. He reopened the full behavioral progression log, expanding the dataset to include uninterrupted temporal sequencing, and the system rendered a sustained engagement curve that no longer showed fragmentation. Oliver's attention was not spiking or fading. It was persisting. Ethan isolated the gaze tracking module again, focusing solely on visual fixation duration, and confirmed that Oliver was maintaining orientation toward Sophie for intervals that exceeded all recorded baselines by a significant margin. Sophie remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady and non-intrusive, and that consistency had become the defining factor in every measurable change occurring within the room. Ethan leaned slightly closer to the screen wall, reviewing micro-response patterns in real time, and observed another subtle movement from Oliver, a controlled shift of his hand that extended longer than previous instances before returning to rest. The system registered the motion as sustained motor engagement rather than reflex activity. Ethan immediately cross-referenced this with neurological output data, and the alignment between physical response and brain activity had become increasingly synchronized. He paused for a moment, then replayed the segment again, confirming that no external procedural intervention had been introduced during that time window. Sophie had not altered her behavior. She had not increased stimulation, she had not initiated structured therapy, and she had not modified environmental conditions. Yet Oliver's responsiveness continued to stabilize. Ethan opened the environmental integrity log once more, verifying that no staff entries had occurred and no automated systems had been adjusted since Sophie's arrival. Everything remained unchanged except for the interaction between the two individuals in the frame. On the screen, Sophie shifted slightly, maintaining her position within Oliver's field of vision without disrupting his focus. The movement was minimal, almost imperceptible, yet Oliver's gaze followed and remained locked for an extended duration. Ethan felt a subtle tension build in his analytical process because the system no longer behaved according to predictive modeling. Every prior framework defined response as a function of structured input, yet here response was emerging from presence alone. He accessed the full historical archive of Oliver's condition once again, scrolling through months of static reports that consistently described minimal engagement and compared them against current live output. The contrast was no longer marginal. It was absolute. Oliver was sustaining attention. Sophie remained calm, her expression unchanged, her behavior consistent, and that stability appeared to be the only constant across all observed changes. Ethan stepped closer to the console, his reflection merging faintly with the glow of overlapping surveillance feeds. And for the first time since the system's installation, he did not immediately seek corrective action. Instead, he observed the continuity without interruption. Oliver's hand moved again, slower than before, holding position for a measurable duration before settling back into stillness. And the system confirmed synchronized neurological response within safe medical thresholds. Ethan's hand hovered near the communication override panel, but he did not activate it. Because what he was witnessing was no longer fitting within the definition of monitored recovery, and every layer of data he reviewed now pointed toward a conclusion he had not anticipated, that the change occurring inside the room was not being produced by intervention, but by sustained human presence that operated outside the limits of his system's original design. In the surveillance command room, Ethan Blackwell stood in front of the monitor wall without changing position, yet the internal structure of his assessment process had shifted from observation to continuous verification, as if every new second of footage demanded reevaluation of assumptions that had previously been absolute. The central feed still showed Oliver Blackwell in his bedroom, with Sophie Carter seated beside him, and the interaction between them had now reached a level of continuity that no longer resembled isolated response events, but sustained engagement over time. Ethan reopened the full chronological behavior model again, extending the analysis window to its maximum range, and the system reconstructed a continuous progression curve that showed no regression points within the observed session. Oliver's attention, once fragmented and minimal according to historical records, was now consistently directed toward Sophie for extended intervals, with no significant deviation patterns detected by the tracking system. Sophie remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and her behavior entirely non-procedural, which made her influence difficult to quantify within any structured medical framework. Ethan isolated the motor response channel again, focusing on fine-scale movements in Oliver's hands and facial orientation, and confirmed that each movement was not only repeatable but increasingly sustained. The system no longer flagged isolated anomalies but began marking continuous engagement thresholds being exceeded in real time. Ethan leaned slightly forward, reviewing biometric synchronization data between neurological output and physical response, and observed a stable correlation forming that had not been present in any prior recordings. Oliver's responses were no longer random or inconsistent. They were aligned. Sophie made a minimal adjustment in position, shifting only enough to remain within Oliver's visual field, and that adjustment was immediately followed by a sustained gaze lock from the child that lasted longer than any previously recorded instance in his entire medical history. Ethan accessed the environmental control log once more, confirming that no external variables had been altered since Sophie entered the room, and every system parameter remained unchanged, including lighting, temperature, and scheduled care intervals. That confirmation removed the possibility of procedural influence, leaving only the interaction itself as the active variable. On the screen, Sophie did not increase stimulation or initiate any structured activity. She remained in silence, allowing the space between them to persist without interruption, and Oliver did not break focus during that interval. Ethan reviewed the entire session playback again at accelerated speed, and the pattern remained identical across every cycle. Engagement increased only in the presence of sustained, non-intrusive attention. The system flagged the behavior as statistically significant deviation from baseline recovery models, but Ethan no longer relied on the classification output. He was observing a structure forming that the system itself could not yet define. He stepped closer to the monitor wall, his reflection overlapping with the layered feeds, and for the first time since installation of the surveillance network, he did not issue a corrective command or attempt intervention scheduling. Instead, he watched as Oliver's hand moved again, slower and more deliberate than before, maintaining position long enough to register sustained motor intent before returning to stillness. Sophie remained calm, her expression unchanged, her presence consistent, and Oliver's gaze did not drift away. In that moment, Ethan understood that what he had designed as a system of control had begun to document something it was never built to contain, because the changes occurring inside that room were no longer responding to instruction, but to something far more fundamental that his surveillance architecture had never accounted for: sustained human connection operating outside the boundaries of measurable intervention. In the surveillance command room, Ethan Blackwell remained standing in front of the monitor wall, but the atmosphere around him had shifted into a state of sustained analytical tension, as if every system he had built to enforce control was now functioning as a passive observer of something it could not influence. The central feed still displayed Oliver Blackwell in his bedroom, with Sophie Carter seated beside him, and the interaction between them had reached a level of continuity that no longer resembled intermittent response but stable engagement over an extended duration. Ethan reopened the full longitudinal behavioral dataset one final time, expanding the analysis window to include the entire session from initiation to the present moment, and the system rendered a continuous progression curve with no regression points, no interruption markers, and no return to baseline conditions. Oliver's attention, which had historically been fragmented and minimal according to every archived medical report, was now sustained and directed with consistency that exceeded prior recorded limitations. Sophie remained in position, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and her behavior entirely non-procedural, which had now become the central variable across all observed changes. Ethan isolated the final sequence of motor and cognitive response data, focusing on the last 20 minutes of live interaction, and confirmed that Oliver's movements were not only sustained but increasingly coordinated with visual orientation patterns that aligned directly with Sophie's position in the room. The system flagged the entire session as statistically significant deviation from established recovery baselines, but Ethan no longer evaluated the classification output as definitive. He stepped closer to the monitor wall, his reflection merging with overlapping surveillance feeds, and reviewed the live feed again at normal speed. Sophie did not initiate stimulation, did not introduce external tools, and did not modify environmental conditions. Instead, she maintained presence with consistency that allowed silence to function as the primary interaction medium. Oliver's gaze remained fixed on her, uninterrupted by external distraction or regression. Ethan accessed the communication override panel one final time, his hand hovering above the activation interface, but he did not execute any command. The system continued to record stable engagement metrics that contradicted every predictive model he had previously trusted. On the screen, Oliver's hand moved again, slower than before, maintaining position long enough to register sustained intentional control before returning to rest, and Sophie did not react with escalation or reinforcement. She simply remained still, preserving continuity. Ethan reviewed the entire system archive of Oliver's condition once more in a compressed scan, and every prior entry reinforced the same conclusion: absence of sustained engagement until this sequence. Now, engagement was persistent. The surveillance room remained silent except for the soft operational hum of the system. Yet within that silence, Ethan understood that what he had constructed was no longer merely a system of observation. It had become a record of transformation that occurred independently of control, and the Final realization settled with quiet certainty that what changed his son was not intervention, but the uninterrupted presence of another human being that the system itself could not replicate, measure, or replace.